All right, Dynasty Podcasts. Jaime Black. I am broadcasting live from Pilsen. It is the 15-year anniversary of Dynasty Podcasts. Now, 5 years ago, for anybody who has been paying attention, who's been following this podcast for a while, 5 years ago, myself and my awesome team, we put together a 10-hour live broadcast with like 50 or so guests coming up to the public hotel, doing this live broadcast with us. It was amazing. It was incredible. Obviously, because of COVID, that's not an option this year. And also, I don't know, I'm older. 15 hours of live broadcasting seemed like a tall hill to climb. So I have an excuse this year not to do it. Maybe next year, or rather 5 years from now, I'll do 20 hours. But that's tomorrow's problem. Either way, thank you for tuning in tonight to watch this special kind of broadcast where really I am just reflecting on, what I have learned from the last 15 years or so of podcasting. So, I want to talk about really how I got started with podcasting and then move into some other topics, some reflections. So, podcasting, I started doing this in August of 2005. So, like August 30th, 2005 was the first episode. That's when we put it out. So, as myself and an awesome team of collaborators, I have to give a shout out especially to my original producer, Zarin Stone, who has been an amazing resource and an incredible collaborator and friend for the last 15 years. So, here's how I got started podcasting. In 2005, I had been working in the radio industry for, God, like 7 or 8 years at that point at Q101, which is not around anymore, but anybody of a certain age remembers Q101 radio here in Chicago. So I was working for Q101 as a producer, tremendous job. I loved it. I really it was such a great job to have. And I have next to no complaints about it because everything about that job was incredible. But if I had to nitpick, a couple things, it was that I was the producer, which was again a job I loved, but it meant that I was not really front and center on the air. I was not doing interviews and I was really like eager to do artist interviews. I wanted to do like long form interviews with like underground talent. And the show that I worked on, Local 101, with Chris Payne, an incredible host and DJ, and lifelong friend, who I got to work with at Q101. Chris was an amazing host, so he was the host of the show. I would book the bands, I would book the artists that would come on the show as guests. And like I said, I really wanted to be able to do on air content, do interviews, but that was just not feasible for a 1 hour show that already had a host. We had 14 minutes or so of commercials. We had to get a lot of music in that hour. We had to get a lot of interviews in that hour. So when I learned about podcasting, which I wish I could say that I remember the exact moment I learned about podcasting, I don't. But it must have been in 2004, 2005, probably 2005. And I was also working at the Apple store. I was teaching people how to use iPods, how to use iTunes, because those are both pretty new inventions at that point. And the iPod was like the hottest gift that year for the holiday season. So I was teaching people how to use iPods. I was teaching them how to use iTunes. I was working in radio. I was setting up artist interviews. I was doing some college radio where I got to do some interviews. I was doing some writing for Illinois Entertainer where I got to do some interviews. Social media was brand new. MySpace was happening, and I was able to promote things on MySpace. Now it'd be called like developing a brand and your voice on social media. That was not the term for it back then. It was just, posting bulletins on MySpace, being like, hey, look at this thing I made. So suddenly I saw that I could take my radio experience, transfer that to the online medium, to, iTunes and iPods, back before the iPhone. And all this is a long way of saying that between my radio background and my tech background at Apple and social media starting to, give young creatives a platform, that was where podcasting was born. So myself and a number of collaborators, like I said, including my producer and longtime friend Zarin Finesse, we started putting these podcast episodes together. We would stay up all night just editing and editing and editing. And I say we, it was a lot more of him editing. But, we would try to put out like an episode every week or every other week. And they were like hour-long episodes. They had a lot of music in them, which is why those episodes are not live anymore on the internet. But back then, we didn't know any better. We didn't know about licensing. So we were putting music in the podcasts. And, now those episodes are not online. So that was kind of where it began, was by bringing my radio experience, my tech experience, and, bringing that to the online platform. And I did not realize that I was going to be podcasting for 15 years. I didn't know that I would be here 15 years later doing this kind of broadcast. And podcasting has opened so many doors for me. So I want to go through some of the lessons that I have learned from my time podcasting over the last decade and a half. And I'm going to share this on Facebook on my own personal page because, in case people want to ask some questions. All right. So, looking back at 15 years of podcasting beginning in August 2005 and bringing us up to now. All right. So I wrote about some of this in my blog, in my Substack newsletter, jaimeblack.substack.com. I'll link that on this post on Facebook Live. But I wanted to go through some of the lessons that I have learned over the last 15 years. So let's start with number one. Really, these are in no order. Let's just say that this is the first one we're starting with. Um, Podcasts are a really incredible and meaningful way to build connections. One of the main things that I love about podcasting is that you can have these long form conversations with, anybody who's willing to sit on the other side of the table with you, or I guess now in 2020, jump on Zoom with you. But for me, it's something where I very quickly in my 20s realized I don't like networking events. I don't like being at a crowded bar, having to yell over music, trying to have a meaningful conversation. The other person can't hear you. You have to kind of yell in their ear, which never feels comfortable. Um, and then you get a business card, and the whole exchange lasts like, I don't know, 20 seconds, right? And what did you really learn? What did anyone really gain from that encounter? To me, I just was not on board with that. One of the things I loved about podcasting and still love is that you can have these long form conversations. I can invite somebody who I respect or admire or want to learn more about, or who I think is doing really cool work. And I can say, hey, can we sit down? Can we do a 20, 30, 40-minute chat? And I have found that I'm able to have such, you know, more meaningful and in-depth encounters and connections through the podcasting platform. So a lot of people ask me like, "Hey, why do you keep podcasting for, 15 years later?" Because it is a very long time. But to me, one of the big things that, really drives this for me is that I get to have these conversations with people and really get to know them in a much more, I think, meaningful, capacity. And, nobody's checking their phone during a podcast. We're not getting interrupted by other people. It's really rare, I feel like, in this day and age to be able to just sit down with somebody and get their attention and vice versa, and just kind of have a meaningful conversation for 20, 30, 40 minutes. So that's one of the things I love about podcasting. Let's start there. Another thing I have learned about podcasting is that you don't have to have the most widespread topic. You don't have to say, like, okay, I'm going to do the Beyonce podcast. Now, I want to be very clear. There are tremendously talented podcasters who have done incredible Beyonce podcasts. That's not the path I'm going to go. I'm not doing podcasts about like Star Wars, Beyonce, the Marvel movies in general. Those are topics that like everybody loves, right? So I have tended to go a bit more niche. I'm going with like covering the Chicago music and culture scene. That's what my Chicagoverse series has been for the last 15 years in one form or another. And that really, I mean, clearly like stemmed from my work on Local 101. I've never been shy about that being the big influence, my work with Chris Payne at Q101. So the Chicagoverse series, it does not get a million downloads. It's not a series where I'm like reviewing Marvel movies the night they come out. But by focusing on a community instead of like the broadest topic possible or the most popular topic possible, you're able to, again, coming back to that connectivity, y- I found that I'm able to build much more meaningful connections that way. And I feel like I'm delivering more interconnected storytelling where, like, the people who are coming on are referencing the work they're doing with other people I've had on the podcast, in recent weeks or years past. So I love that I've been able to, in all this work, whether in radio and print or in podcasting, tell the story of what's happening in Chicago or be one of many people who is telling those kind of stories. To me, having a niche focus really, I think, has brought value to what I do. And to me, it's made the process more enjoyable. I would just really like that I get to keep having on people from Chicago and tell this kind of like larger, you know, um, meta story about what's happening in the city versus just being one interview with one person. The next one has nothing to do with the previous one. And along those lines, something else I have learned from both my radio days and from podcasting, especially, it's that the behind the scenes talent has the best stories. So, again, going back to when I worked in radio in the 2000s, our show, Local 101, that I worked on at the radio station, again, great show. I loved it. But we only had an hour. We had to play commercials, like I said. So, first and foremost, we were a music show. So by and large, we had musicians on more often than we had behind the scenes talent. Now we did have behind the scenes talent on. We got to have like people like Joe Shanahan and like Riot Mike from Riot Fest. We had people on who were not musicians, but they were the behind the scenes movers and shakers. But I wanted to be able to really build that out and do like an hour long interview with those kind of people if I wanted. So over the course of the last 15 years of Dynasty Podcasts, I have had on, venue owners, festival producers, graphic designers, directors, photographers, promoters. Realizing I'm talking a lot with my hands right now. I'm doing this, by myself. So what I have learned is that, and I guess what I knew and what I've found again and again, the people who are behind the scenes, they have the best story. So yes, like let's say you're going to interview Drake. I have no doubt that would be like an amazingly cool interview. But I bet equally interesting, if not more, is interviewing Drake's manager, or Drake's publicist or Drake's stylist, because those are the people who generally don't do as many interviews, but they see everything and they get to have such cool experiences and they have cool stories. So, an example of that is in 2017, I did a live panel event with the team that produces Lollapalooza. I got some time, I got an hour with the team from C3 Presents out of Austin, Texas. We did a live panel event on the Monday of Lollapalooza week in 2017. And I got to host a panel with them with a live audience. And those people never get to talk about how they put Lollapalooza together, or, very rarely. They're not the focus. If Foo Fighters and Lady Gaga are headlining Lollapalooza, obviously the press focuses on Foo Fighters and Lady Gaga. It totally makes sense. But I have loved getting to interview the behind the scenes people, the industry, the creators and talent who are not on stage, but they're side stage, they're backstage. Those people have incredible stories. Um, Another takeaway that I have learned from this time as a podcaster, that would be you're doing the job of an entire radio station as one person. So again, going back to my time in radio, which I spent 13 years in radio, so that really informed a lot of my broadcast career post radio. But when I worked in radio, you had the on-air department, you had the promotions department, sales department, programming, you had so many different departments, and there was, 30, 40, 50, 60 people working at any given radio station, like a major market radio station, right? When you're a podcaster, you can start solo, but if you want to scale your podcast, you either have to bring in contributors and or you're kind of doing the job of a radio station all by yourself. So, when you're pursuing sponsorships, you're the sales department. When you're editing your show, you're an audio producer. When you are, contacting guests, researching your talking points in advance of an interview, guess what? You're the producer. And obviously you're the on-air talent as the host, and on and on and on. And I very quickly realized when I started doing my podcast, by myself or with a smaller team of contributors, where there wasn't a radio budget, there wasn't kind of like all these resources at our disposal. It was a lot more DIY. I was like, oh my God, this is really doing the job of an entire radio team, but as one person, or maybe as, yourself and a couple collaborators who are able to help out, here and there. But it's a large task if you really want to build your podcast out and scale it to something bigger. And that very much brings me to my next point. Podcasting, it really can be a team sport. So everything I've been talking about, this takes so much time, energy, skill sets. You may be great as a host. Like, I'll speak for myself. I think I know how to host a podcast, but I'm not good at making, flyers. I'm not a graphic designer. I can squeak by on a Squarespace template, but I'm not a web designer, right? So I've been really fortunate that I have had incredible contributors who have brought their talent to what I'm doing, in arenas where I was just not going to be the best person for that role. And I want to give a shout out to some people who have helped over the years. And I'm not going to be able to name everybody. In a perfect world, I would. But, right off the bat, like I said, Zaron Stone. Zaron Finesse was his, podcast name. But Zaron Stone, he was the first person who came on and started producing the podcast, started editing the episodes, made our first website. I mean, and this was 2005. I mean, there was no money. It was not a cool thing to do. It was just this completely, it could not have been more DIY. I mean, there weren't YouTube tutorials. I can't stress how Flintstones it was in our initial setup. And he made it seem like we had like an entire NPR library, and resources behind us. Audrey Sutherland, who has been an incredible contributor, collaborator, producer, friend for the last, God, 5, 6 years. She has done so much to bring the podcast to what it is now in the last half decade. The modern current version of the podcast. Natalie Aurelia, another amazing collaborator who came up to me at one of the panels and said, "Hey, I want to help out." And she right away demonstrated that she was going to be an invaluable contributor, not just booking guests, but also helping with photos, helping with social media, and just really bringing so much of the tone and focus of what the podcast has been in recent years. Um, Marcus Carter, Danielle Sage. Marcus did our websites. Danielle has done so much of the awesome logo work and, the artwork for the podcast, and they have been an incredible force to have, available to me. Madison Keenan has done so many of our flyers and so much of the current graphic design and some video production. Ingrid Legends has done audio work. Pro of Crivachet has done audio work. On and on. Michael Wing from Autograph. I've gotten to produce a number of panels with him. And here, this is the part where I could just keep going. So it's been 15 years. I've worked with a lot of people, but I needed to give at least those people a huge shout out because their talents have been so just incredible in terms of building the podcast into what it is right now. So if you want to scale the podcast, if you're doing a podcast, let's say, have a good team. You're going to have to, and this I think applies to any creative project. It's like you want to scale it, you want to build it out. Oftentimes, you're going to need to have collaborators because most people, or at least I'm going to speak for myself, I don't know how to do every single digital thing out there. In a perfect world, I would, but there's only so many hours in a day. Find great collaborators. I've been very lucky to have incredible talent help me on the podcast over the years. Building on that, another takeaway that I have learned, and I'm just going through this list, man. I mean, there's a lot here. Hopefully, this is interesting. But to me, I just wanted to at least break down some behind the scenes of how this all works. So, visual presentation, I just talked about, how these great collaborators, Danielle Sage, Madison Keenan, Marcus Carter, have helped with the visual presentation of the podcast. This really makes a difference. And Natalie Rulio with photos. It makes a huge difference when you make your podcast visual. Now, as a podcaster, maybe that sounds weird, or maybe it doesn't, but podcasts are not an inherently visual medium, right? You think of podcasts as something you listen to, it's auditory, right? But visuals get people's attention so much more instantaneously than just audio alone. Sharing audio on social media does not do a whole lot, but sharing a great flyer, a, logo, a high quality photo, that can get people's attention. So visual presentation really matters as a podcaster. And along the same lines, podcasting is not just audio anymore. It's not an audio only format. I mean, I'm doing this as a live stream. I started live streaming with the podcast in 2012. And I really learned that doing this with visuals makes a big difference, So make sure if you're doing a podcast, if you're a aspiring podcaster watching this, add visual content, whether that's a live stream or a video component, or just a lot of photos. Again, that visual presentation matters. Find out how you can scale out your podcast. To me, live streaming has been an incredible resource because you don't have to really edit the podcast. It's a very instantaneous kind of platform, and you can engage with people in real time. I love all those things about it. Shifting gears, another takeaway from the last decade and a half that I have learned from podcasting, it's an incredible platform for educational content. And that was not something I really had in mind necessarily when I first started doing this, but that was a goal as I continued podcasting that kind of like kept creeping into my head that we could do something cool with podcasts. So I launched this panel series, the Dynasty Panelcast Industry Series in 2012. It was something I'd been pitching around the city for a few years, and Rocket Bar and Grill, Billy Deck, and Tim Toomey, I have to give them a shout out individually. They were the first people to believe in the podcast on any business level, and they gave myself and my collaborators a platform at Rocket Bar and Grill, which, if you've been in Chicago for a few years, you remember Rocket Bar and Grill. in River North, that was like a hot spot in River North. And once a month, we'd get to do panels there. And it was an incredible opportunity. So the first panel we did was in 2012. And since then, I've done panels at venues like Chicago Athletic Association Hotel, Public Hotel, with themes like how to break into creative tech, how to break into the festival industry, breaking into professional music journalism. The idea was I really wanted to put together events where, young creative students, people who wanted to learn more about different types of, industries and different creative paths could come out to an event that was all ages, that was free. They didn't have to buy a ticket. You didn't have to be like, oh, shoot, I don't have $25 to go to this webinar. I wanted to keep these free. We always kept them free. And people were able to come out and learn from all these different professionals from all these different, major companies. I mean, we had people like from Google, LinkedIn, Twitter, Spotify, Lollapalooza, and that's just a handful of the companies that came out and spoke at different Dynasty events. But one of the things I'm most proud of from the last 15 years of podcasting is that this has been able to be an educational platform at times. And we've gotten to these events where young creatives can come out and learn from, you know, just these incredibly accomplished industry professionals. And that's similar to my next takeaway. Learn from your guests. For me, learning from the people I've had on the podcast has been it's been a master's degree. It's been a doctorate. It's like I've had hundreds of people on the podcast, at least somewhere in the neighborhood of 900, 1,000 different people on the podcast over the last 15 years. And getting to learn from them and have these, like I mentioned earlier, these in-depth, meaningful, thoughtful conversations and learn about other people's perspective, other people's experience. Like that has been something that to me is just invaluable. I could not have, you know, learned that. I could not have bought that experience, I should say. Let's see, making sure that this stream is still going. Yep, it is. Okay. All right. Couple more takeaways that I have learned from 15 years of podcasting. I started doing this podcasting workshop, going back to the educational component of this. I started doing a podcasting workshop about 5 years ago. The first couple of years, it was just kind of like scattershot around the city here and there. I brought it to 1871 a couple times, brought it to a couple different colleges and stuff, but it was something that was in its infancy. I was testing it out. In 2017, I launched that podcasting workshop on Airbnb. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But one of the questions I always get in the podcasting workshop is people asking me, how do you monetize your podcast? And it's really hard. Now, the people who ask this generally, they haven't made a podcast yet. They're at the very beginning of their journey. I get why it's a question people ask, but also, that's really, it comes later in the process. I've been able to build a business out of my podcast, which I will talk about in a second, but it is hard. I want people to know it takes time, energy, commitment. It takes money, collaborators, a lot of trial and error, a lot of, returning to things, trying them again, trying them a different way, and also luck and timing to be able to scale your podcast into something that can be sustainable and provide some kind of financial return. For me, podcasting really became my path to becoming an entrepreneur. I've been working as a freelancer and a creative in some form or another for like 22 years now, which I feel very thankful to have had that opportunity. But it was something that, I did not go to college to become an entrepreneur. I mean, most people do not. And there were not, podcasts and Google and YouTube, resources in 2002 when I was like in college, to figure out how to build your own business. That didn't exist. Those were not resources. So I had to really learn how to become an entrepreneur through a lot of trial and error. Really, it was just the hard way. And it took a long, long time. So like I mentioned, the Rocket Bar and Grill, panels, that was the first time I ever got paid to do the podcast in any capacity. It was the first time I ever received money for something related to my podcast, which was like the coolest feeling in the world. So starting with events at Rocket Bar and Grill and then scaling those events to like Public Hotel, Chicago Athletic Association Hotel, and other hospitality brands. That was an opportunity for me to, collaborate with hospitality industry brands, work with them on events, work with them on digital media content. And from there, I was able to scale out to, entrepreneurial projects and build some campaigns and some paid projects with those brands. From there, I started doing consulting and production. I did production for Crane Chicago Business for 2 years for their Daily Gist podcast and the predecessor for that podcast. I did consulting for a year and a half with Goose Island for podcast projects. Um, I mentioned, building out the Podcasting 101 workshop, and now I have a few other podcasting and live streaming workshops that go along with that. I am broadcasting this from a podcast studio in my work live space in Pilsen that up until COVID, I was renting out by the hour for other podcasters who wanted to, be able to come in here and record their podcast. Um, podcast coaching. I just launched podcast coaching. I mean, there's a lot, but one by one, I started scaling all these different ways that I could monetize my podcasting experience, which became a masterclass for me in entrepreneurship. But like I said, it took years. It took a lot of trial and error. It took a lot of just yelling on social media about everything I'm doing. Anyone who follows me is very aware of that. So it did not happen overnight, but it was something that, you know, eventually was able to pay off, and I was able to build a business from my podcasting work. But like I said, that is not easy and it does not happen overnight. Something else that I have found to be really interesting about podcasting over the last 15 years is the fact that you can really record so many different ways, so many different places. So for example, I have done podcasting where I've recorded out of a very, very high class, radio station studio, just like complete state of the art studio. And I've also done recording where I'm just recording my own parts, like an intro or an outro or something like that, or an ad read. I've done that before I had this studio that is available to me. I have done that with a handheld recorder underneath a heavy blanket. And man, I will tell you, I feel so stupid when I used to do that. I don't do that anymore. And boy, it was hot. But I felt so stupid doing that, but the audio sounded good. You couldn't tell that I wasn't in a studio. So to me, it was all about just doing it DIY however I could. Now everything I record is over Zoom at this point in time because of COVID, but I can't wait to get back to in-person interviews again eventually. I've done interviews from green rooms, from, boardrooms, from marketing agencies, from hotel event spaces, and having a great handheld recorder. For years and years, I was using the Olympus LSP4 or LSP6. I was using an Olympus recorder. I had it so long that I don't remember what it said on the box. But either way, using an Olympus, and I was going to places like South by Southwest, Lollapalooza, Riot Fest, different conferences, different festivals, different states, and just traveling and doing interviews with this handheld. And this handheld recorder really became like my passport to be able to go to interesting, venues and locations and events and record on site. And that opened up so many doors for me. So a lot of times I hear people talking about like, well, what's the best mic to get? And I have a lot of opinions about that. But there's also something to be said. I hear this a lot in regards to photography. Just record with what you have. And if what you have is your smartphone, record with your smartphone. Go with that because it's better than not having anything to record with, because you can always scale your recording setup, but just start creating content. Um, Another lesson I have learned from 15 years of podcasting is that I kind of got here too early on a lot of things. So I started podcasting in 2005. I started trying to set up live podcasts in 2010. I started live streaming in 2012. Those were times where just it didn't. Now, I know if you're watching this right now or listening to this as a podcast now, you're like, wow, okay, big deal. You wanted to live stream. But people didn't understand live streaming in 2012. People certainly didn't understand podcasting in 2005. So I think I've mentioned this before. It was a lot of trial and error and a lot of patience to kind of wait for some of these platforms to mature and arrive as a mainstream kind of medium. But I was really eager to get to these things very early on. I wanted people to know about podcasting in 2005. I wanted people on radio to be excited about podcasting in 2005. I wanted people in 2010 and 2011 to want to do live podcast events with live streaming components. And that was just not something that people really had on their agenda at that time. Now in 2020, the main thing I'm looking at is building out my own online classes because I don't think, I know we're in for a very rough 2 years in the academic space. So I'm developing, additional online classes, online workshops, because I think the face of college and, the university experience and how people learn online learning is really going to become a force over the next few years. And we're really seeing that really start to take hold in the age of COVID. So that's where I'm at now. And it's not going to happen overnight, but I'm pretty used to that. All right. I went through a lot. For anybody who's still watching, anybody who's listening to this, I appreciate it. Final takeaway that I learned from 15 years of podcasting is just don't be precious. Reinvent your approach to your podcast. Or, if you're doing something else, filmmaking, writing, whatever that is, right? But you have to be able to reinvent your creative craft. So the way that I started podcasting in 2005 is not the same way I was doing it in 2007 or 2012 or 2015 or today. I have had to tweak and adjust and change so much of what I do with the podcast over the last 15 years because the way that it works one year is not going to be the same way it works a number of years later. In like the early 2010s, I was podcasting and publishing those episodes on SoundCloud. And at the time, I had like 50,000 followers on SoundCloud, and that would just blow up the content. And then Spotify came along, and suddenly SoundCloud, at least for podcasts, was not the platform anymore. So I had to, revise my approach with where I was publishing those episodes, things like that. So all I'm saying is that, over the years, to me, podcasting has become something where every every 2, 3, 5 years, I am revising how I'm podcasting, what that approach looks like, what the tools are that I'm using, who I'm talking to, all these kind of things. And I just have learned that you can't be too nostalgic or too precious with how you approach things. You have to always be open to things being adaptive. I mean, if I was younger, I would probably be putting the podcast content somehow on TikTok. I don't know. I'm in my late 30s, so that's probably not the platform I'm going to go to today or tomorrow. But maybe next year it'll be different. But if I was 24, absolutely, TikTok would be the platform that I am using for all of my digital broadcasting content and publishing needs right now, probably. So that's a long way of saying just don't be afraid to reinvent whatever you're doing. I have certainly seen that again and again in my podcasting career. Okay, I went through a lot. This is just something that I thought would be useful that I really wanted to do, at least for myself, if for no one else. But obviously, I'm going to share this online as well. But I very rarely do a podcast by myself. I almost always have a guest or multiple guests if it's a panel, because I don't know, it's kind of weird doing a podcast by yourself. At least for me, I'm not used to it, and I probably talked pretty quickly. But either way, this was something I wanted to do because I wanted to be able to talk about what I have learned from 15 years of podcasting and put it out there in a long form medium, not just a tweet or a couple of tweets, which I love tweeting, but those are so compact, and I wanted to be able to deliver something a bit more long form to talk about 15 years of this, process and this journey that I have been on with podcasting. So for everybody who's tuned in, who's watched, all those kind of things, I definitely appreciate it. And follow dynastypodcast.com. That's where we're publishing all the content. Dynasty Podcast Chicagoverse on Twitter. Or I'm sorry, not Twitter, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And, ultimately, I think I have more years of podcasting in me. I definitely have some things I want to do with the podcast once travel opens up. I've got a lot of ideas about kind of podcasting on a more mobile kind of method, going out and really, I think, road tripping and creating podcast content that is not just in one location. Anyway, I have a lot of ideas about what I want to do next, but like I said, that's going to be continually reinventing and trying some new things and seeing what works and what doesn't. But either way, I have been incredibly fortunate to be able to podcast for 15 years now. I mean, as of today, which is crazy and insane. And again, thank you to everybody who has followed along, who has attended any of the panels, listened to any of the episodes. Anyone who's been a guest on the podcast. I hadn't even mentioned that we've had just incredible guests over the years, and I've been so insanely fortunate that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, nearly 1,000 or somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 people have said yes to being on the podcast. Probably more because of the panels where we had 4 or 5 speakers each. But all that is something that I just have been so fortunate to have been able to do, and all the people who have been part of the journey as listeners, as attendees, as guests and all of my contributors over the years, who I'm going to give a shout out to all on Facebook when I post this. Again, I can't thank everybody enough because I wanted to do radio really early on. I'm not joking. When I was 13, I was like, I'm going to work in radio. And I just went around telling people that at school. Anyone who knows me is going to be like, not surprised to hear that. But literally at 13 years old, I was telling people, I wasn't saying, I hope one day I work in radio. I hope. I was just telling people at 13, I'm going to work in radio. I got my first internship at 15. When I was in high school, I did like 4 radio internships. And I got to have a 13-year career in radio. I got to have a 15-year career in podcasting, which I'm still going to be, continuing with. But I feel so fortunate to have done that. And again, because of people who have listened, who have watched the live streams, who have come out to the panels, who have guested on the podcast, who have contributed to the podcast, as all of my collaborators have over the years, those are all the people who, I mean, basically everybody in this journey, I just have to say thank you, because I've gotten to do this work that I love. I've gotten to build a business out of it, and I've got to talk to just incredible people and go to incredible places and find incredible opportunities because people have supported me podcasting. So thank you to everybody who has been part of that. Thank you to everybody who's watched this tonight. And I'll have more coming, facebook.com/ Dynasty Podcast. That is where all of the content lives. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in and watched and supported at any point in any way over the last 15 years.